Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when I was on stress leave, so I ended up going on stress leave from one of my jobs because of um, everything that was happening. I thought this was just prevalent in nursing. I thought, nurses that didn't really do so well at the bedside and didn't quite get along with their team would be the sort of people that applied to management positions and moved up. But as I talked to all of my friends, I realized that every single one of them said, no, this happens in my workplace too. And they all work in very different professions. So I started to realize it's not specific to nursing, although I think bullying has, it might be more prevalent in nursing. I do think that what you're describing happens all over in all different professions, and I just don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
It comes down to the incentive structures in these organizations, right? So much of the incentives are based on production. They're based on getting the product out to whomever, or getting the funding based on pushing your performance in this direction, whatever that might be, right? Whatever your end goal is, it's a kind of like we got to get to that no matter what it takes and no matter how many bodies we lay behind us. The what has to change kind of at the very kind of 30,000 foot level is that the incentive structure needs to change. Like the reason that the systems are self-selecting for these types of personalities, and the reason why, for instance, 1% of the population are psychopaths, but 20% of executives are psychopaths, is because that system is selecting for the traits that are kind of take no prisoners. It's kind of Machiavellian way of doing business. But if you change the incentives so that, for instance, there are some hospitals where a portion of the funding the hospital receives is based on internal, what they call 360 reviews of nurses and indicators of unhappiness, but also indicators of bullying, will result in lower funding.
That's actually really interesting that you said that, Jordan, because actually, so I know a lot of organizations, they do those like those surveys, right, Sarah? They do the, what are they called? Like the staff engagement surveys. And I always find it interesting what they actually do with those results, because the hospitals get these results, and let's say there is a result where there's poor satisfaction on the nursing end. What is it that usually ends up boiling down to? Oh, they need more education. That's what will make them more happy and more supported. And it's like, actually, there's probably other issues that you need to look at. Like, maybe the reason why you have high attrition is because of those structures and things that are put in place where we're not incentivizing good behavior, where we're actually allowing this negative behavior to continue to perpetuate. And those behaviors are almost seen as being rewarded, because you may go and you may complain to your manager, and either they're apathetic or they don't have the support in place to help deal with it either. So I really feel like at that management level, and really going up to that macro level, is there's got to be some real clear criteria, or real clear interventions that we link towards, if this behavior is occurring, how do we, one, deal with it at that level, and then two, if for example, it's continuing and it's occurring, like, we can't just continue to let it occur. Maybe it comes down to the point where they managers are supported, that they actually say, this is a performance issue and we may have to let you go if this continues. I know that's huge issue, because nurses have strong unions. And I know it always goes back to the fact that it's like, oh, I'm untouchable. It doesn't matter. Like, I got my union behind me, and my union will support me. So people don't even necessarily make these complaints, because they feel that, like, so I feel there's already a situation where our own unions are a part of the problem. Like, we have these they're supposed to be supporting us, but then now, if we're having issues internally with our other nurses, it's so hard to necessarily get rid or fire a nurse, that our own management systems don't necessarily support um, well, maybe there is no policy to kind of deal with lateral nursing violence or horizontal violence in general, or
Yeah, well,
just
just
bullying
going
in
back to
general.
what you were saying, Amy, I was thinking as you were talking about, what happens to the victim. So in nursing, I'm not aware of very many exit interviews happening. So when a nurse quits, do we ever have that conversation? Like as managers, do they ever have the conversation with the nurse about, just general, let me know why you're leaving, if there's something we can improve on for the future? I really feel like that conversation doesn't happen. At least in my experience, I've worked at three different hospitals. I've never once been asked why I left. I mean, not officially, not in writing. So I wonder if
Right.
that's something that could be explored a little bit more. And maybe even some sort of template, um, if they could just indicate on a general level if it was due to work conditions, if it was due to coworkers, or what it was due to. And if we could somehow translate that into the bottom line, because that's what all hospital executives want to know, right? If we say that your turnover rate is really high,
Right.
this is what it costs to recruit a nurse, this is what it costs to train a nurse, and so ultimately, this is what it's costing you to lose nurses because of the poor work environment. That might actually get their attention. But that's not really something that the average person can do. I just think,
Well, I mean, sorry, Sarah, to interrupt, but as a safety guy or a former safety guy and prior to that an HR guy, I can tell you that when you show somebody the classic iceberg model where you're like, well, this is the tip of the iceberg of the cost, but if you look underneath the surface of the water, there's this huge number, like there's this huge unseen cost to attrition and this kind of stuff. It's true, absolutely. Like if you're talking about safety or whether you're talking about attrition, I mean they both. I mean when you're coming from essentially an HR standpoint, that's your whole bread and butter, right? Is to explain to justify your existence. You show how you can save costs. But these folks who are in charge of the workplace, they're not as interested in waste and unseen costs as they are on production and the costs that they can see. And it's unfortunate. Even like highly intelligent people in these roles, they're very driven by, essentially they're driven by the metrics that their bosses are driven by, right?
Right.
And a lot of these issues that are underneath the surface, these intangibles as we call them, they don't directly impact your OpEx, right?
Right.
And so, and they take a long time to change, which is the problem, right? A lot of these guys are just looking at their fiscal year end, trying to make budget, and they don't have the 5 years to get their attrition level down to the point where they'll start seeing real change. And maybe they're not even thinking of staying in that role for 5 years. They want to get their bonus this year. They want to make sure that they get the attaboys this year so that when they apply for the job at the other organization, they can say, well, I, did X, Y, and Z. If you go to another job interview and you say, well, over the course of 10 years, I lowered attrition by X amount and I saved this amount. I mean, one, it's hard to quantify. And two, a lot of organizations go, well, that's fine, that's good. But, well, how many widgets did you get out the door? And how did you decrease operational costs immediately and that kind of stuff? Like a lot of these companies are just driven by this kind of immediacy, right?
It almost sounds like you're actually kind of hitting the nail on the head, that maybe the call to action for a cause against lateral nursing violence is actually to lobby the government to say, hey, you guys give organizations and hospitals and all these areas huge amounts of funding for a variety of different things. We need to start looking at why there's attrition, and maybe a part of their funding is looking at those staff satisfaction surveys and really saying, hey, you know what, we see this much attrition, we see this much issues, and in terms of your reporting structure about lateral nursing violence. And that's a whole other thing, because I don't even know if they're keeping any data from like an occupational health perspective to say, like, maybe you're coming in sick because of X, Y, and Z and because of your bullying. So really maybe the call to action is to lobby our governments to say, hey, maybe we should pull back if hospitals aren't, or other organizations aren't performing based on attrition and based on statistics, that we're actually asking our employees and our staff, have you been bullied, is this the real reason for your sick time? Like, and seeing that if we could have like an open, non-threatening type of environment. But again, I think that might be what we'd be having to look like. I think that's where it lies. It's kind of unfortunate that we might have to monetize it, but maybe that's where the incentive lies. Like I know there was a couple things I wanted to touch on in terms of like one, I think in terms of looking at interventions. So one obviously is looking at just changing behavior in general. So how do we change, like we know it's a huge culture. So how do we change this behavior? And I really think this would be getting feedback from one, your frontline staff, administrators, right across the board to kind of serve as like a stimulus for improvement. And there really should be like how you're getting this information needs to be mutually respectful and very non-threatening, non-punitive. Again, I think the other aspect is maybe of course we always talk about education, but really maybe it is to educate and actually talk about how do we deal with bullying and lateral violence and harassment within the workplace. And I know a lot of organizations have a zero tolerance policy for harassment, but not necessarily a zero tolerance policy for bullying. And I'll touch on that a little bit more too. But really, I feel that there should be some clear instruction from organizations on how to deal and how to address with this lateral violence. One study talked a little bit about something called cognitive rehearsal to affect educational, it's an effective educational method to address lateral violence. So essentially what they did was they took a whole bunch of new hires that were coming in, they taught them about a lateral nursing violence, and then gave them these kind of laminated cards with responses on how to deal with lateral nursing violence scenarios. So after a year, they looked at the nurses and they did like a focus group in terms of and asked kind of open ended questions about lateral violence and the effect of their training, including the actual rehearsal. And they said like I think the number was something like 95% of the participants reported that they saw lateral violence occur on their nursing units, and half of them actually described it happening to them. So one in two of that sample had actually dealt with it themselves. But they said surprisingly, 100% of the participants said that they confronted the perpetrator and that the lateral violence actually stopped. So I think that's huge. Like, I really
That is
think we
awesome,
need to
actually.
look
It
and
sounds like
address
they're
the
really
culture.
innovative because I have never heard of anything like that happening before. To where you give them the tools that they need, that it's right at their fingertips,
Yeah.
and that the employees are reporting it made a real difference in their work life.
And you're giving them a tool. You're adding something to their toolkit to help. Just for example, let's talk about like having a postpartum hemorrhage. We create a toolkit, right? We put our misoprostol in. We get our Bacri balloons. We have a whole kit of things that we might need if that patient's hemorrhaging. Why wouldn't we not have the same tools to equip us if we have or if we have or we're experiencing lateral violence? Why not give someone the tools or the things to say to help deal with that person? Like, I think that is the start of how to deal and combat with changing behavior.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Amy. I mean, it's just gonna have to start, one conversation at a time, one hospital at a time, and really, like you said, getting some people out there that are really vocal and have a lot of public presence to just start speaking out about this sort of issue.
Yeah, it's a many points of light solution, I think. Like you can't like the causes are numerous. Like the reason this problem exists is not because of one thing. Anything other than the fact that women are put under these huge amounts of pressures societally, and that the incentive structures are misaligned, and that's across all systems. Is that these systems that the incentive structures are misaligned, and that we're prioritizing the end goal at the expense of the people that it takes to get there, and I think that again we have to do many points of light. We have to change the incentive structures at the top end so that these people are encouraged to create a I mean, this is how we do safety. Like something called TRIF, which is Total Recordable Incidents Filed, I believe, or found, or one of those. Anyway, those are directly tied in a lot of cases to CEOs' bonuses at the end of every year. Now, of course, that creates other issues where
Of
they kind
course,
of
yeah.
try and fudge the numbers and that kind of stuff. But the whole point is at least you have them caring about incidents. Whereas before, I mean, if you look back even in the 80s and 90s, I mean, safety was a joke in the workplace. And still, to a large extent, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think the same can be done with workplace bullying, especially when it comes down to management and management against management, where you don't have unions that you can rely on to come in and help you deal with this stuff. It's not just you with your colleague; it's you. It's a lot of a lot of bullying comes from the fact that you're reporting to somebody. There's that power imbalance, and that person is taking advantage of that fact. And if the incentives were aligned differently where you have more power. I mean, my buddy out in the oil patch was discussing the other day that his boss was treating him poorly and apparently treating everybody else in the department poorly. And they did a 360 review and they all were very honest in their 360-degree review of their boss. And she got performance managed, and it was a huge shock to her because she wasn't aware that she was treating him in this way. And she very quickly modified her behavior because not just because it was the right thing to do, but because she realized that there was consequences to treating people as a means to an end rather than an end unto themselves, to quote John Stuart Mill. Right? It's important to treat people as an end unto themselves and not just as another cog in the machine for you to get what you want and to make you look good. And I think it was drawn into sharp relief for her that the people under her had a voice and that their voices were heard and that the consequences to her were very, very real and that she could potentially lose her job for because she wasn't treating them well. And this is in an oil company, which is as capitalist as it gets. But I mean, I think preceptors should have the same thing. They should have a 360 review done by their students, and the consequences for bullying should be swift and severe, and that their ability to hold on to those positions as preceptors should be based on the fact that they're getting satisfied students. I mean, you're not going to be able to satisfy everybody, but if you're treating your students well, the chances of you getting 50% of your students unhappy with you is pretty low. But also bear in mind that these changes need to be advocated for from the bottom up. People in power are not going to want to change the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you made so many good points, Jordan. And Amie, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yeah, there's a couple things that I did want to kind of touch on, and then I think it might be apropos for us to kind of wrap up. So, kind of what Jordan was saying, really that administrator involvement, and I really think executive management does play a key role in addressing the issue of this really disruptive behavior. And if I kind of just think about my own experience, usually my first encounter with my manager shouldn't be about me actually telling them that I've been bullied. So like I feel if managers aren't typically engaged and that's when they start having a relationship with their staff, that there's a huge problem already. I feel that and I could be wrong, that maybe some staff members perceive administrators as not really finding this issue as important. And I feel that really to make this something, a movement where people are actually doing things about it, that management, the executive team needs to actively be participating in daily activities in the workplace for any type of policies on lateral bullying to really actually be effective. I think they should be like the managers and the senior leaders, they really should be finding out about behavioral problems so they really can be a part of the solution and really look at improving the quality of the work environment and sending that message to the staff. I think that would be hugely important from even at my own level. Like if I was a staff nurse working, if it was coming from the senior leadership team that, hey, we really want to know what's happening, we're really asking the questions, it would show me that they were really involved, not just at this kind of, oh, we have a zero tolerance and we're not doing anything, because I feel that that's actually a really ineffective model in terms of dealing with it. um I think just even maybe having campaigns where they talk about that the staff and the whole environment should be working with courtesy and respect, and that really if they were looking at having a lateral nursing violence policy, I think it would be something worthwhile to actually maybe invest in. But what would a policy on lateral nursing violence look like?
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, like everything else in nursing, it should be evidence based. I think that this is such a huge issue, and it's such a huge issue. First and foremost, it's an issue because it affects people, and then secondly, it affects patients, and thirdly, it affects the finances of a hospital because attrition is a hugely expensive endeavor to deal with. And then that's not to count all of the other things that Sarah mentioned, which are lost time because of illnesses and going on short term and all these other things. And just lost productivity because you're zoned out or you're not productive because, how can you be productive when you're in fight or flight mode, right? I think I've lost my train of thought now. I bunny trailed too far.
Well, I mean, I think that even just talking about policies, really, if we had like some type of a consistent approach and roadmap that we had that we could deal with lateral nursing violence or bullying in the workplace in general, I think that would be helpful. I know one of the articles I read talked about a best practice council that kind of legislated and standardized practice across hospitals. They really looked at what were the narrative types of situations that they were dealing in terms of bullying, and really looking at those narratives and building policy around personal stories and personal accounts of bullying. I also feel that if a policy was to be created, that this should include anything that would address really, I guess, lateral violence. So, and if there was a committee, they should have real clear direction, aggressive timelines, interventions that are specific to the situation and environment, and then a short term commitment and kind of bringing that loop full circle and really closing out those cases where lateral nursing violence or bullying has occurred in the workplace. Um, I did mention that I think the whole zero tolerance policy is ineffective. And really, I think it's because it's actually just a passive dissemination of information. And really, it's just a statement. I don't think anything's really done. People say, oh, we have a zero tolerance. But what does that actually mean?
Well, I mean, so often with these kinds of things where it's the workers who are the ones impacted and not so much the executives, it's really important to watch what people do rather than listen to what they say, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much pablum and so much trite nonsense that you hear coming out of executives. It's just canned crap that they get from their HR department, or they heard a TED talk and it sounded really good, but what are they doing? What concrete steps are they taking? And you can tell when an executive board is really interested in something and motivated to do something, because they put their money where their mouth is. And for a lot of stuff, not just bullying, but I mean, especially bullying in this case, but even safety and stuff like that in a lot of workplaces, they don't really put their money where their mouth is. A lot of, like Amie mentioned earlier, a lot of the solutions are administrative based. You can tell when a company's not interested in safety, for instance, when a lot of their solutions to incidents are administrative. So training and, putting up posters and kind of band-aid solutions that cost them nothing to make, nothing to implement. And the same goes with bullying. Oh, we're having bullying issues. Well, just buy like 500 anti-bullying posters, post them up on every unit, and make sure you talk to your staff for 5 minutes on Monday.
Right. It's just like checking off another thing that you have to do on top of the 100 other things you're doing already off the side of your desk. It's not really having an impact. I want to say to our listeners too, if you have any sort of suggestions or ways that you've dealt with bullying or harassment in the workplace, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you for listening to our podcast. If you enjoy listening and you want to support us, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And our episodes are also available for download on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. So you can send us a suggestion or question that way. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks